Hey everyone, and welcome to the final part of our Girls Who Code at Home Activist Toolkit project. If you're not ready for the final part and you need to rewatch or watch for the first time any of the other portions of this project, you can go to the Bellwood Public Library page, find Teen Central, and then scroll down to our Teens Learn Online and Girls Who Code at Home. From here, you can find all the previous videos that we've put out. And if you head right back to the Teen Central, go to our virtual programs, you can find the link to open up your activity PDF, which you will need for today. We'll be working straight from the PDF completely. You scroll down to the bottom here and you can find the PDF right here. All right, I've already got a copy open, so we're going to head back on over to this, and we're going to go ahead and jump right in, try and give you guys a little bit shorter video this time. All right, so last week we added in our CSS all those colors, sizing options, images, and that's great. But one of the things that we want to focus on this week is how to make that design responsive to different size screens, like your laptop, a tablet, mobile devices. And so we'll be doing that today using some flex properties in CSS. Okay. All right, so you'll need to have Trinket open, which I've already grabbed here and opened up to my Activist website. But you can open it from the link right here. You'll want to open up the project that you worked on last time, so all that code you did in part 4. And then we've got some final project example code here, which we'll go ahead and open so we're ready when the time comes. And that will have some coding that we can copy and paste into our own project here in Trinket to create some of the flexible properties that allow your design to be responsive to different sized screens. Okay, we are in our final week, part 5, so we're almost done. But if you've enjoyed doing the coding these past few weeks, I will show you how you can find a few more projects from Girls Who Code. All right, for our Women in Tech Spotlight this week, we've got Tegan Widmer. When Tegan was in grad school, she noticed that Safe2P, a website helping LGBTQ community members find safe bathrooms, had shut down unexpectedly. Although she majored in theater and had no experience with coding, she decided to attend a hackathon and eventually created Refuge Restrooms, which is an open source gender-neutral bathroom locator. You can go ahead and continue reading. Basically, Widmer is still involved in coding, even though that was not the subject of her grad school study, and she continues to maintain Refuge Restrooms, which has since been launched for several different operating systems. Okay, and I'm going to leave it to you to go ahead and watch this video where Tegan talks about her application on Social Good Apps Breakfast. But I will highlight the question right here, our reflection question about our Women in Tech Spotlight. And you may want to watch the video first. But it says, how can the world at large benefit from people from all different communities learning computer science? Okay, so you can take a little time to watch the video and reflect on that question. I'll give you a few seconds and then I'm going to move on so we can get right into things today. All right, we're ready to move on. So in step 1, we're going to take a few minutes to just kind of learn about responsive design and what that means. And the big question we're going to answer is, how do I design my website for many different devices? So you may have noticed while we were working on our past few projects that when you're working in that results screen, you have to save, publish, and open it up in the full web page frequently because it doesn't look the same. So it shows you a completely different design in your results page than it actually shows on the full laptop size page. Okay. What that means is that it's breaking your styling So it is breaking the rule sets that you've created inside your CSS document, and it doesn't look the way that you've told it to look. Okay, and it mentions that that result screen is smaller. It's the same issue if you were to open up your project on a smartphone. Okay, so we want to use responsive design that allows that layout to change and maneuver in ways that makes it still readable and effective when your users are looking at it across different devices. And so they give us an example with the Girls Who Code website. In a laptop size, tablet size, and a mobile device size. There. Okay. And these pixel numbers at the bottom are the pixel sizes for those screens. So we'll talk about breaking points later in today's video, but it will be dependent on the pixel sizes of those different screens to make those changes. And if you notice here, we've got our normal page, which looks slightly different here. It's got a slightly different menu bar. If you notice, this navigational bar here has turned into a small menu bar on the side. Okay. And when it's seen on a mobile screen, this text that was off to the right moves underneath the image, and we still have that menu button here rather than the full navigational bar. So there are differences that take place. Right. So what they mean by responsive design is that elements on the page can resize and adjust their layout, fit to different screen sizes, because most people these days are not accessing websites solely from their computer. A lot of us may, do it from our phone, maybe a tablet, and that may be the only way we access. So if you've ever noticed a website that you try to open on your phone and, pictures run off the side and the text gets really weird, that's because the design is not responsive. Okay. So the two techniques that we're going to look at today are called Flexboxes and media queries. Your Flexbox is going to allow you to create different positioning rules that is a little bit easier than that just simple box model that we learned about last week with the margins and the borders and things like that. Your media queries are a way of saying once the screen size hits this specific size, gets this small, then it triggers a specific rule set. And so the media query tells it to look for that. And we'll get into those and discuss them in more detail. All right, so I'm going to scroll on down and we're going to meet the Flexbox. Again, this is a really short portion. We're just kind of talking about what that is. So like it says in our last activity when we were doing part 4, we learned about the box model as a way to lay out elements on our website. And it's really great for some things, but like it says, when you have a collection of elements, like our images, that you want to size and align in a particular way, it can get difficult when the screen size changes. So Flexbox can help us out here. And it can easily position, like it says here, a set of 3 images horizontally from left to right, using nav bars, different style elements, things like that. So last week when I showed you how to do those images, I used class selectors and ID selectors and things like that to create that. We're going to learn a different way to do it today that is responsive, and so you will have those images that go across your page when it's full size, but when it becomes slightly different, it will resize them. So when you go down to that mobile sized app, it can resize those images automatically for you. Okay. If you want to look out for more uses of the Flexbox, you can go ahead and click on this link right here. We're really just going to talk today about the Flex container and images that they're going to show us how to do. So there's way more things you can use it for, and that's worth looking into. All right. So our Flexbox is actually short for CSS Flexible Box Layout Module. Okay. And as they update CSS rules and systems, new things like that come into play. So it is part of the current version of CSS. Like it says here, it allows HTML elements to change their size and position based on the size of the screen. And so they live in a special Flex container that is a defined size. And that's where our div tags come in handy, like we did around our images. And putting this Flex container in there allows elements to shrink, expand, or wrap into new lines to fill the space inside the container as needed. And what that means is that they won't end up overflowing. So you won't have a page where you'll have 2.5 images and one is partially cut off and you can't see the whole thing simply because of the design. Okay. It also means that they'll all be the same size. If that's what you choose, they don't have to be, but we will be putting in code that allows them to change so they're all the same size, regardless of how big they were to begin with. Okay. And as it says here, our Flex container is the space or all of those items together that we're putting them all in there. But each individual item, like the images we'll be using, are referred to as a Flex item. So when we go in and put in our class selectors, which is how we're going to go ahead and do the Flex items and the Flex container, it will specifically address those items through div tags. Okay. That was quite a bit in a very short period of time. So if you feel like you need to go back and look at your PDF activity kit just a little bit more, maybe access some of these to kind of get a feel for the Flexbox, that's fine. I'll give you a few seconds pause, and then I'm going to move on to adding our Flex container, which means we'll actually put the code in to create the Flex container. Okay. All right, we're going to go ahead and scroll down and start step 3, where we want to add the Flex container. All right, so like I mentioned before, to be able to define and select that Flex container, we're going to use the div tag, and we're going to add a class attribute or selector around the items that we want to add in the Flexbox. So to illustrate this particular concept, we are going to create a Flexbox around the images on our home page. And if you've got any corresponding image attributions, those will be included. So we're going to think back to part 3 when we did our HTML and we added those div tags around the row of images in our wireframe. And that's what we're going to turn into our Flex container. Now, last week I showed you how to do rows and columns with the images to get them to line up across the page. So I'm actually going to pull that up real quick. We created right here. Okay. So what we're going to do today will actually undo this bit of code. And if you don't necessarily want to completely get rid of that, what you can do is go ahead and make a copy of your Trinket project and then make those changes to add the Flex container and the Flex items inside of it. And if you find that you like that better and you want to keep that, you can save that version and then get rid of this. But if you want to hold on to it just to make sure you don't want to keep this, then having that copy is a good idea. All right. So if we look at our wireframe, or the what would have been our wireframe, each of these images has their own div tag, but we've also got a div tag outside of that where we're going to add this class selector called Flex container. Now you can change the name if you want, but I'm going to go ahead and use the name that they've created. Okay. So we're going to go in. We're going to go to our index page. And we're going to look first for the Flex container. We're talking about this first div tag that currently here says row. Okay. I'm going to create a copy of this. And I'm going to rename it. Okay. And then I'm going to save that into my trinkets. And that's where I'm going to make the changes, just so I don't have to completely get rid of what I've done before and you guys can see it. Okay. So I'm going to replace this row with flex container. And as you can see, that has now created some really weird stuff going on here. But that's okay, we will fix that. Okay. All right, now once we've added that here, we then need to create the CSS rule set. Okay, and so where they're telling us to go is under images and comment under the home page. So we'll go into our style.css. And we're going to look for home page and then images. And this is exactly where we've created these, column and row. What we can actually do is get rid of that because we're not going to be using those style sets in this particular project. And once I delete those, it goes back to what it originally looked like before, which is just these images on the page. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and create right. So now I've created that class selector here for the rule set. That looks just like this information right here. Okay. And that's the first part. We're just creating that tag. There's no actual information inside the tag yet. We'll get to that in a later step. Okay, so you can go ahead and pause now. Add that into your project. And in a second, we'll move on to then creating the pieces we need for our flex items. All right, so now we're going to add the flex items, and again, it's going to be, we're just adding in those, the class selector, and then we'll be adding in the CSS rule set tags before we go into adding the actual properties. Okay, so this part, we're still looking at div tags, like it mentions here, but we're going to look at the individual div tags for each image. So in our code here, it's going to be the different image divs that are inside of the flex container one that we've just created. Okay. So same thing, we're going to go into our project. We're going to go to our index page and where we had previously written column, if you've done so. If not, go ahead and you're going to add class equals flex item. Okay, and it's not doing anything yet because there are no rule sets associated with that class selector. But we are going to go then into the style sheet, and right underneath where we've created that flex container, we're going to create period flex dash item, and then put in our brackets. And so now we have created the brackets that we need to in the start of the rule set so that we can put in the properties that we want inside here to make changes to this page. Okay. And I know it looks like there's a lot of text on this page, but it's really just telling you to do everything I just showed you. So it's real short and simple. And you can go ahead and add that in right now so that it will end up looking like the code in this picture here. And then your style sheet is going to have these. Okay, so once you've added those, we're ready to move on to step 5. And here we're going to look at some Flexbox styling properties. Okay, so to look at the Flexbox styling properties, we're actually going to go back to the cute animals project that they showed us in our, I believe it was part 3 or 4. Okay. And we don't actually have to pull that up. We're going to look at the changes that it makes right here in the PDF kit. But because this page is so simple, it doesn't have a bunch of, it doesn't have the CSS rules mostly. It's just got the text and the images. We'll be able to see how those changes happen. Okay. We're actually going to move on pretty quickly and start talking about the Flexbox and how it deals with a page. So we're going to look for 5 specific styling goals as we look at the changes that are being made to the Cute Animals project, okay? And our first goal is that we want to lay out 3 cute animal images in a row, very similar to what I showed you last time. We want all the images to stay on one line. If the screen size changes, we want the size of the images to grow or shrink in response to that. We want the images to be equal width in this case. And then our last goal is to have a little bit of space around each image so they're not all kind of bunched up together, okay? All right, so they're going to start us out by showing us the Flex container properties. And they mentioned that we can achieve several of them, the goals below, using the Flex container, since we want to apply this stuff to all of the Flex items, okay? So the first is display, which would look like this inside your code. So we're going to set that display to Flex. Okay, so that's what it means by adding this here. And then what that does is it turns it into a Flex container. Whatever that div tag is turns into the Flex container for us. And so what that does is it gets at our first goal of laying out 3 images in a row. Right? Now, if we want to make sure that they're in that row, I mean, they look like they are now, but that could change depending on the size of the layout. So we need to specify for the browser that they need to be in that row. And we'll do that with the Flex Direction property using the value row. And it can change whether you want them to be, left to right, right to left, top to bottom. All of that is affected by this. So you would use different properties if you didn't want it to be in that row. If you wanted it top to bottom, things like that. So it tells it how to create the row or a column if that's what you wanted. Okay, and they give you the other options that can be set to. So far, that still just gets at our goal number 1. And it looks like this, even though we've added the row property. Okay. I'm going to explain all this first, and then I will show it to you in my project so that you can actually see that take place. But the images here should illustrate. All right. As it mentions here, we're also going to use the Flex Wrap property, which looks like this. And so right now, all of these items are trying to fit on the same line by default. And as it mentions here, sometimes you may not want that. You may want to allow them to wrap and position themselves on different lines, especially if you have a mobile device and you would better be able to see the images if they wrapped onto the next line individually rather than shrinking in one line. But for now, we want them to stay in that row, keeping them all on one line. That's our goal number 2. So we're going to put no wrap as the value for this property. So they won't go on one line, they'll stay in this row here, and then they will just change in size as the size of the screen changes. And it also gives you some other options. You could decide it to wrap or wrap reverse. So instead of this going here, it would be this goes down. Okay, so it all depends on how you want those to be. So these are the 3 main properties we're going to have specifically in our Flex container rule set, okay? And what it mentions here is that we want to check in on goal number 3, which is changing the image size proportionally to the screen size. And we can do that by changing the size of the screen. So when you see this little screen here, they're very small. As the screen gets bigger, obviously these items get bigger. Now, obviously we're not changing the screen, individually to show you, but when I go in and put it in my project, I will do that to show you what that actually looks like. All right, so before we apply those, we're also going to look at the properties for our Flexbox items, okay, which would be the individual images themselves, not the whole container. So as I mentioned, you can add these different Flex item properties in addition to your regular CSS properties that you've been working with. In this one, we're only going to use Flex Basis for this one. And then margin, and that will allow us to meet goals 4 and 5 that we set for ourselves. Okay, so we'll start with Flex Basis. So it sets the initial size of the item, which in this case is our images, before the space is distributed based on the Flex container rules. So we're going to use it to decide how big our images are going to be. If you look at this picture right here, these two, the pig and the skunk, are about the same width, but our little hedgehog over here is much smaller. And what we want to do is set a property that allows us, it'll automatically change these so that all 3 images have the same width. Okay. What I mentioned here is you don't want to use pixels in this case because that's a definitive size. When you use percentage values, it allows it to fill up that percentage of space proportionally to the rest of the screen size. Okay. So it says, because we set our flex wrap property no wrap, all these images are on one line, but right now they're not equal in width because the image sizes are different. They have different pixel sizes. So what we're going to do is set our Flex Basis property right here inside our Flex Item rule set. And we're going to put that value at 100%. So that tells it that each item or element inside of it should display at equal width. And the results page, once you put this in, will look like this. Obviously, the hedgehog picture has gotten a little bigger in this side, and these two have gotten a little smaller to make space. So we've met goal number 4, which is for the widths to be equal. And if you remember, goal number 5 was to give them a little bit of space around the edges so that they're not touching like this. And we're going to do that with a margin property. Okay. So they've used a very small margin, just 1%, and that gives just enough space in between here so that all the images are individuals, they're not bunched up together, they're not running into each other. Okay. You could set that to different percentages if you want to, if you want more space between those images. But doing that will also create, it'll make the images a little bit smaller to fit in that space as well. So something to think about, okay? So we talked about all of those properties. In the next step, we're going to apply all those properties to our own projects to see how that will look. Okay. But as I mentioned here, there are way more Flex Container and Flex Item properties than the ones that we are going to be using today. And it allows you to do a ton of other stuff that we're not going to talk about. So you may want to explore those options and learn a little bit more about it. As I said, it might be a little bit confusing to get all that information at once. So they've got here the CSS tricks, a complete guide to Flexbox, and Flexbox Froggy, which give you practice exercises that you can do with Flexbox properties. Okay. Since we'll be moving on to the next step, if you need to take a few more moments to look over the material that we just looked at in step 5, you can go ahead and do that. I'm going to go ahead and pause, give you a few seconds before I move on to the next stage. All right, let's go ahead and move on to step 6, which is adding those properties that we just learned about into our project. Okay, so we're going to start out with our Flex container properties right here. We've already added in the class selector Flex container inside our page, if you remember here. So we've added this, and in our style sheet, we've created that brackets for the rule set. So we're going to add this information right in. And I'm actually going to pull it right from here, but you can also pull it from their style sheet here, where they've placed all the way down here their Flex container and their Flex item information. Okay. First, let's take a look at what all of it does. So all of the information that we'll be putting right into our page, we start out with that Flex container class selector for the rule set. We're going to use the display property to create that Flex container around those images. We're going to use Flex directions so that all of the items inside this Flex container display in a row. And then we're going to use the Flex wrap property to keep all of those items on one line by using the no wrap property. Okay, so I'm going to go in here and pull the exact same information. And it actually tells you exactly what it says here. And remember, these comments will not show up, so it's okay to copy that as well and add it into the project. Okay. Right. Right. So as you can see, now that I've created the Flex container, it looks really strange. But my images are all in a row and they are not wrapping onto a new line. So that's where the Flex wrap and the Flex direction properties come into play. And when I start adding information about the Flex items, that's when these sizes will become more equal, because obviously this doesn't do me any good to have an image that is super tiny and barely recognizable while these two are much bigger. So we'll go back to our PDF kit. And then we're going to scroll down just a little bit more and look at those Flex item properties, okay? So this is going to be built up of, again, that Flex item class selector that we talked about. We're going to use the Flex basis to set all of the items to the same size, so they equally distribute within the space. And we don't want any extra space between them. And then when we add that margin, it adds a little bit of space around the images so that they can breathe. They're not all running together, okay? And like I said, you can try different values until you're satisfied with how the display looks. I'm going to leave it just as is on the 1% margin. But I am going to go into their project and pull that information. So I'm going to pull the Flex basis and the margin. And then I'm going to put it inside the rule set that I've created. And as we can see, all of my images are the same width, and they have that space between them. All right, now we want to make sure, because we're seeing it in the results panel, but we want to make sure that it still holds these properties true when we see it in a different sized screen. So when we see it in the full size screen, okay? So I'm going to go ahead, save my project, and share it. And then we're going to open it up in the full page and see how it changes based on that Flex container. All right, so in this one, obviously my images are bigger in size, so the Flex container worked. It changed the sizing of the proportionally based on the size of the screen. And you'll notice that as these are much smaller, these are much larger, but they're still the same width on all images, and they've still got that margin space between them. Okay. And if I minimize or maximize the screen here, we see those images changing proportionally. Okay, so that's what that Flex container is really good for. All right, let's go back to our PDF kit. All right, so we tested it out like they suggested. And we decreased and increased the size of the screen just to make sure that those are really doing what we want them to. They do get into, if it's not working for you the way that it's supposed to, you may want to look for any typos that were introduced when you were typing in the properties and the values. If you copy and paste from their kit, you shouldn't have to worry about that. But if you're typing it out yourself, check for those typos. You want to make sure there is a semicolon at the end of each property. Remember, that was an integral part that we looked at when we were talking about CSS rule sets last week. And we want to make sure that our curly brackets for our rule sets are closed. So we may have a starting bracket, but not an ending bracket, and it will not apply if we don't have both brackets. Now, you may have noticed in here, once I added my first bracket and then hit enter to go down to the next line, it created the end bracket for me. So that may not be an issue for you. Right. And then the last bit is you want to make sure that you've done both parts of adding those rules, which means just because you've created the rule set inside the style sheet, if you don't put those class selectors inside your div tag, so that class equals flex container or class equals flex item, then it will not know where to apply that information that you've created in the rule set, and it won't do it for you. Okay. Go ahead and give you some time to pause and add that stuff into your project before we move on to looking at media queries. All right, so let's move on to step 7. Okay, so as they're suggesting here, we defined our responsive web design as a way of styling the website so it changes and adapts based on the size of the screen that your audience is using. And the Flexbox is only one of those tools that you can use. But there may be times when you specifically need to style based on the size of your screen. So in the example that it gives here, if we make our browser as small as it can go, the Flexbox works. It scales those images proportionally to the size of the screen, but it might make them so small that they're difficult to see. And we have no idea, you know, your person reading that is like, what is this? I can't tell. Okay. So in that case, the Flexbox does what it is supposed to do, but it's still not helpful. And that's the case where we might need to use a media query. Okay. And this is kind of a tool that specifically allows us to say, change the CSS rule based on the screen size, or in some cases, the media type. So today in particular, we're only going to focus on the screen size queries. Okay. But as it mentions, and we remember that our W3 Schools is an infinitely useful resource when we're doing coding with HTML and CSS. It has more information on media types and media queries, and so you can follow this link to look into that more. Okay. All right, so we're going to look at some of the language that is used inside a media query, and the first part of it is this at media. So it says to create a media query, we use the at media rule to define the type of media we want to apply the styles and conditions to, in this case, our screen size. So that's what the browser is going to test for. And if the conditions that we'll set in the rule set, if they're met, if the browser sees that that meets those, it will then apply those rule sets only in those instances. Okay. So that full bit is going to look like this. All right. So it's using another bracket to set up a rule set, and the rule sets we want to use, the properties are going to be in here. But this is how we designate what these rules apply to. Okay, and it explains the breakdown of what each word in there means. So this is the keyword to indicate a media query. So you have to have that at media. You put in media type to specify the type of media that it applies to. And in these cases, your values can be screen, print, speech, or all of them. We specifically today are only going to be covering screen as our media type. We have the and in there because we're going to have two separate conditions that have to be met before these rule sets are applied. So that's when we would and. We have the media type, in our case screen, the specific feature condition that needs to be met, okay? So we use parentheses to indicate we are setting conditions using one or more media features, and then we mention that media feature here. So certain conditions have to be met for these rules to apply, and that's specified here. It sounds a little more complicated, and that's why you may want to look at the W3 schools, more about their media queries and their media features and all of that information if you want to do anything beyond what we are going to test out here today. Okay. All right, so we are going to add a breakpoint for step 8. And we'll do that using the media query that we just saw broken down for us here, okay? All right, so when we use the term breakpoint, it's used a lot in responsive design, and what it alludes to is the point at which your style breaks down. So it's the size of the screen where the rules and the elements that you have in there, they don't work anymore. It breaks. So it mentions this, that you may have noticed a website break when you tried to access it on your phone, but it wasn't designed for the mobile phone. And that was kind of what we mentioned before when we were talking about the Flex container with images that are half on the page and half disappeared, or buttons that are all squished up against a side and they're not working correctly, or text that's moved outside of a box that it was previously in and it gets all strange and it's on different lines. That's what it means when your style breaks. It's hit the breaking point. Okay. So they give us here a few common breakpoints as a reference. So 320 to 480 pixels is about the size of a screen for your, smartphones and small devices. We've got sizing for medium-sized devices like tablets, sizing for medium to large devices like laptops, which is what I'm working on right now. Your desktop computer might have an even larger screen. And then if you have a TV, which, as you know, you can access different applications. If you use your gaming console to access a streaming service or things like that, the size of that screen is even bigger, okay? All right, so the next portion of this is to actually add in a breakpoint in our rule sheet using that media query that we saw, okay? So we're going to use that media query to fix it. What they mention here is if your screen is roughly less than 850 pixels, your flex items become really small, okay? So in that case, instead of keeping them in that one row on one line, where they're going to keep getting smaller and smaller as the screen shrinks, it might be better to have them in a column on multiple lines. And so we're going to use the flex wrap property that we talked about earlier, right, for our flex container, and we're going to put in a media query that says when our screen hits this point or smaller, that's when we need to change the rule set in that flex container. So it'll start to wrap instead of being on the same line. And it'll show us how to do that right here. Okay. So this is our media query. And as we talked about, we have the media type. Right? The media type is screen, and then the media feature that we want to change, which is our max width, because that is the breaking point, okay? And then inside, because remember this creates a bracket, inside that media query, we're going to add in a rule set, very similar to the one we currently have with the flex container, and then we're just going to change the flex wrap to wrap. So it'll say, when the screen hits a max width of 850 pixels, our flex container switches to flex wrap. Okay. And then you can add, as it mentions here, you can add more rule sets if you want them. You can change the header and the main. And this affects some of the text and things like that, and changing the padding on those so that they will move. I'm going to go in now into the Girls Who Code project. We're going to find that information down here, and it says change CSS based on screen size. Okay. So our breakpoint 1 for screens that are 850 pixels wide or less, we're going to add in. Let me just make it so you can see this better. All right. We're going to add in that media query. Because the way I added it in here, it doesn't have the second bracket. As you can see, okay, so when I hit enter, it doesn't add at that time. So we're going to go ahead and hit enter one more time and add that final bracket. So this is at least set up correctly. And then we're going to go back and we're going to grab that flex container rule set like we mentioned. That now will add a wrapping property when the screen is too small. So as we can see, our result screen is actually smaller than 850 pixels. So in this screen, what it then wants to do is add that flex wrap. Let's go ahead and save that and see if it changes when I have it the full-size laptop screen. Okay. All right, and as we can see in the full laptop size screen, my images are still side by side. But if I minimize, that flex property that we added makes the change. The viewing screen of the web page is now less than 850 pixels, and so those items wrap onto the next line. Okay. It's pretty neat. All right, we'll go ahead and close that out. All right, let's head back to our PDF kit. And you can add this in if you choose to. I'm not going to because they actually don't show it in their bit, and the main important part is this flex wrap here. But if you want to add other rule sets, you can feel free to do that and change it as needed. Okay, we already went ahead and tested it like they suggested. If you are going to add other breaking points, they give you some resources to find out about more responsive web design. So you can go to Mozilla and Free Code Camp. This is the last main portion that we'll look at today. So if you want to go ahead and pause now, and you can add in those breaking points to your website, play around with that, explore some of the different resources that they have. I will pause for a few seconds and we'll move on to the last section of our project. All right. So step 9 is really just going to talk about a lot of the other different options that you have for your website. So in this series, it may have felt like we talked about a ton of information, but we actually only scratched the surface of what you can do with HTML and CSS for your website. Okay, so you could decide that you want to add more content, you want to do some really nifty stuff that we didn't explore through the last few weeks. So it gives you some options of different extensions you can do, which you can do more customizations with CSS, you can add more pages, you can consider making your website more accessible. And we did talk about a few different types of accessibility, making sure that our colors don't clash in such a way that they're not viewable by people with different color blindness, adding in those attributive or the alternate text tags for people who have vision impairment. And so the Web Accessibility Initiative will talk about more things like that that can help it make it more accessible to all viewers. Okay. If you want to look into adding more media, like videos, image galleries, in this case, audio, maybe you've interviewed some people and got stories to kind of really support your cause. So you can look at some of these different tutorials from the W3 schools and add those items onto your website. All right, so those are some options. You may want to pause now and try out some of those ideas or make more changes to your project because you haven't finished your CSS, things like that. But once you've gotten it to a point where you feel that it's finished, remember to share it with your audience. Because it mentions here, the web is a powerful way to communicate a message. And learning to code like this and creating this project like you've done is just one way for you to take action for a cause that you find to be important. So hopefully in all this stuff, you learned a few nifty tricks to add to your activist toolkit. Right? And the final portion is really something we've talked about each week. If you want to, you can share your project with the girls who code at home so they can see what you've done with the really awesome series that they've created, but also sharing it so that your audience and the people that you're trying to reach with your message can see it as well. Okay. Before I go ahead and end this video, since this is the final part of our project, I did want to steer you guys back to the Girls Who Code at Home page, simply because this is just one project series that they've offered. There are a ton of other projects that you can jump into if you enjoyed coding and you want to learn more, or if you're like, well, maybe this was a little difficult for me and I want to try something a little different, a little simpler. There's something for everyone. So we'll go ahead and take a look at the Girls Who Code at Home page. All right, so as it mentions, they release new activities every Monday. Some of them are online, some offline, different levels of difficulty. Some of them will be for beginners, some will be intermediate. Some of them might be, advanced learners. So you can pick and choose which products you try. This one here is intermediate, but it's programming your own game. This is depicting data. If you scroll down far enough, you see that this is the portion that we're actually doing today. So they go back, you can go back past this and find stuff they did earlier in the summer, digital memory book, lots of options. So hopefully this project is not your final coding project, that you'll go on and you will continue to learn and explore what can be done with code. I want to thank you guys for learning this process along with me and allowing me to teach you as I go along. And I wish you guys luck with finishing your websites and making them extremely awesome. And hopefully you've had a lot of fun through this series. Thanks for joining me. Have a great day.